As today's chairman of Goodyear Tire knows, for corporations to dominate government, a coup is no longer necessary.
Corporations have gone global. And by going global, the governments have lost some control over corporations. Regardless of whether the corporation can be trusted or cannot be trusted, governments today do not have over the corporations the power that they had and the leverage that they had 50 or 60 years ago. And that's a major change. So governments have become powerless compared to where they were before.
Capitalism today commands the towering heights and has displaced politics and politicians as the new high priests and reigning oligarchs of our system. So capitalism and its principal protagonists and players, corporate CEOs, have been accorded unusual power and access. This is not to deny the significance of government and politicians, but these are the new high priests.
If you've ever wondered why the cost of prescription drugs in the United States are the highest in the world, or why it's illegal to import cheaper drugs from Canada or Mexico, you need look no further than the pharmaceutical lobby and its influence in Washington, D.C. According to a new study by the Center for Public Integrity, congressmen are outnumbered 2-to-1 by lobbyists for an industry that spends roughly $100 million a year in campaign contributions and lobbying expenses to protect its profits. And one reason those profits have exceeded Wall Street's expectations is the Medicare prescription drug bill. It was passed 3.5 years ago, but its effects are still reverberating through the halls of Congress, providing a window into how the lobby works.
Mr. Speaker, I request a recorded vote.
The unorthodox roll call on one of the most expensive bills ever placed before the House of Representatives began in the middle of the night, long after most people in Washington had switched off C-SPAN and gone to sleep. The only witnesses were congressional staffers, hundreds of lobbyists, and U.S. representatives like Dan Burton of Illinois and Walter Jones of North Carolina.
The pharmaceutical lobbyists wrote the bill. The bill was over 1,000 pages, and it got to the members of the House that morning, and we voted for it at about 3 a.m. in the morning.
Why did the vote finally take place at 3 o'clock in the morning?
Well, I think a lot of the shenanigans that were going on that night, they didn't want on national television in prime time.
The House will be in order. The House will be in order.
Steve, I've been in politics for 22 years, and it was the ugliest night I have ever seen in 22 years.
The legislation was the cornerstone of the Republicans' domestic agenda and would extend limited prescription drug coverage under Medicare to 41 million Americans, including 13 million who had never been covered before. At an estimated cost of just under $400 billion over 10 years, it was the largest entitlement program in more than 40 years, and the debate broke down along party lines.
This is a 15-minute vote.
But when it came time to vote, the Republican leadership discovered that a number of key Republican congressmen had defected and joined the Democrats, arguing that the bill was too expensive and a sellout to the drug companies. Dan Burton and Walter Jones were among them.
They're supposed to have 15 minutes to leave the voting machine open, and it was open for almost 3 hours. And the votes were there to defeat the bill for 2 hours and 45 minutes. And we had leaders going around and gathering around individuals, trying to twist their arms to get them to change their votes.
Mr. Speaker, I move reconsideration. I did not, thanks to your arm twisting.
It was horrible. I mean, we had a good friend from Michigan, Nick Smith, and they even threatened to work against his son who wanted to run for his seat when he retired. I saw a woman, a member of the House, a lady, crying when they came around her trying to get her to change her votes. It was ugly.
On this vote, the yeas are 220, the nays are 215. The conference short is agreed to.
When the prescription drug bill finally passed shortly before dawn in the longest roll call in the history of the House of Representatives, much of the credit went to former Congressman Billy Tozan of Louisiana, who steered the bill through the House.
No, it's just a messy process. I mean, the old adage about if you like sausage or laws, you should not watch either one of them being made is true. It's a messy process.
The voting machines were open for 3 hours. Why?
Because the vote wasn't finished.
You didn't have the votes.
No, it wasn't finished.
And arms were still being twisted, right?
People were being talked to.
Walter Jones said it was the ugliest night he had ever seen in politics in 22 years.
Well, he's a young member. Had he been around for 25 years, he'd have seen some uglier nights.
But it certainly wasn't ugly for the drug lobby, which invested more than $10 million in campaign contributions during the last election and has been a source of lucrative employment opportunities for congressmen when they leave office. Former Senators Dennis DeConcini and Steve Sims, and former congressmen like Tom Downey, Vic Fazio, Bill Paxson, and former House Minority Leader Robert Michael all registered as lobbyists for the drug industry and worked on the prescription drug bill.
Other members wish to change their votes?
Why was the drug lobby so interested in this bill, and what did it have to gain? Ron Pollock, the executive director of Families USA, a nonpartisan healthcare watchdog group, says it all boiled down to a key provision in the legislation. It prohibited Medicare and the federal government from using its vast purchasing power to negotiate lower prices directly from the drug companies. What was the main focus of the lobbying effort?
Well, the key goal was to make sure there'd be no interference in the drug companies' ability to charge high prices and to continue to increase those prices.
And whose idea was that?
There's no question that this was prompted by the pharmaceutical lobby.
The drug industry says that competition among private insurance plans that service the Medicare program help keep prices low. But Families USA reported in a January study that Medicare patients are being charged nearly 60% more for the top 20 drugs than veterans pay under a program run by the Veterans Administration. What was the logic, or what was the idea or the rationale behind not giving the government the ability to negotiate drug prices?
It was simply that the drug companies didn't want it. They wanted to make as much money as possible, and if there's negotiation, like there is in other countries around the world, then they're going to have their profit margin reduced.
Before the vote, Congress was told the program would cost a whopping $395 billion over the first 10 years. In fact, Medicare officials already knew it was going to cost a lot more.
Within 2 weeks after the bill was passed, everybody knew it was going to cost well over $500 billion. Many members of the Congress that voted for it said, I would never have voted for it had I known that. They misled us.
Medicare Chief Actuary Richard Foster later told Congress that he revised the cost estimate to $534 billion before the vote, but was told to withhold the numbers from Congress if he wanted to keep his job.
And there struck me as a political basis for making that decision. I considered that inappropriate and, in fact, unethical.
Foster says the person who told him to withhold the revised cost estimates from Congress was Medicare boss Tom Scully.
I want to thank Tom Scully and the whole staff at HHS. And
Scully was the administration's lead negotiator on the prescription drug bill. At the same time, he was also negotiating a job for himself with a high-powered Washington law firm, where he later became a lobbyist for the pharmaceutical industry.
He was negotiating for his job at the same time that the Medicare legislation was being considered. He wound up taking this job 10 days after the president signed the legislation.
It is but one example of the incestuous relationship between Congress and the industry, and just one of the reasons the pharmaceutical lobby almost never loses a political battle that affects its bottom line. Former Congressman Billy Tozan, who helped push the prescription drug bill through the House, didn't disagree. Has this bill been good for the drug industry?
it's been good for the patients whom the drug industry represents.
And in terms of profits for the drug companies?
In terms of profits and volumes, yes.
Your old friend John Dingell says of the 1,500 bills over the last 8 years dealing with pharmaceutical issues, the drug companies almost without exception have gotten what they wanted.
Yeah, I would think he's correct. They've done fairly well.
Why has this lobby been so successful?
I believe it's because they stood for the right things.
If former Congressman Tozan sounds a lot like a lobbyist for the drug industry, that's because now he is.
Billy Tozan of the House of Representatives did great work on this bill.
Just 6 weeks after the prescription drug bill was signed into law, Tozan began discussions with the pharmaceutical industry to become its chief lobbyist in Washington. He says,
"That's the truth."
In fairness to Billy Tozan and former Medicare chief Tom Scully, they weren't the only public officials involved with the prescription drug bill who later went to work for the pharmaceutical industry. Just before the vote, Tozan cited the people who had been most helpful in getting it passed.
And I specifically want to thank the staffs of our committees. From Ways and Means, John McManus, who did such a great job.
Within a few months, McManus left Congress and started his own lobbying firm. Among his new clients were Pharma, Pfizer, Lilly, and Merck.
From the majority side of the Finance Committee, Linda Fishman.
Fishman left to become a lobbyist with the drug manufacturer Amgen.
Not the least of all, but the Energy and Commerce Committee staff who toil so hard for us. Chief of Staff Pat Morrissey.
Morrissey took a job lobbying for drug companies Novartis and Hoffman LaRoche.
And Jeremy Allen.
He went to Johnson & Johnson.
Kathleen Weldon and Jim Barnett.
She went to lobby for Biogen, a biotech company. He left to lobby for Hoffman LaRoche.
They did a marvelous job for this House, and we owe them a debt of thanks. Thank you all.
In all, at least 15 congressional staffers, congressmen, and federal officials who worked on the prescription drug bill left to go to work for the pharmaceutical industry, whose profits were increased by several $billions.
They have unlimited resources, unlimited. And when they push real hard to get something accomplished in the Congress of the United States, they can get it done.
Elections are usually an exciting time for the American people. However, with the two-party system dominating the political establishment here in Washington, some ask whether there are higher powers at stake and how much influence they wield over the city. Now, someone who's no stranger to this topic is Ralph Nader. He was a presidential hopeful under the Independent and Green Party ticket. He sits down now with RT. The dangers of corporate capitalism is something that you've been following all your life. I wonder about the corporate influence in this election cycle and in Washington in general. Are the corporations creating movements like the Tea Party to maintain their control or their interests?
Yeah, that's their popular front, so to speak. Just like the Communist Party had its popular front, the corporations, knowing they can't be out front because people don't like a lot of these big corporations. They're ripped off by the banks, the credit card companies, the insurance companies. They have the camouflage. And the camouflage is they give the Tea Partiers certain deceptive information and focus on certain politicians. And therefore, they continue to work their will behind the scenes. I mean, we have corporate socialism in this country where profits are kept and losses are socialized on the back of the taxpayer. There isn't a single department or agency in the U.S. government whose outside influence overwhelmingly is not corporate. They control from their outside and putting their executives in high government positions, funding members of Congress with their cash, 35,000 full-time lobbyists in Washington. They are the government. Theodore Dreiser put it very well many, many years ago. He said, the corporations are the government. I see primarily the manipulators of the Tea Partiers, and the Tea Partiers resist it, but they are being channeled in various ways. Dick Armey's group, for example, money that's going into their activities. They are, in effect, focusing on hating government, but not the corporate part of the government, like the military budget, the corporate welfare, etc. They want to vector them to hate government when it's defined as Social Security, Medicare, and other services to the people.
You know, Franklin Roosevelt, back in 36, I think it was, in his acceptance speech in Philadelphia in July of 36, quoted he said, an old British judge once said, a necessitous man is not a free man. And I'd say for the better part of probably close to 200 years in the United States, we understood that there's a substrate on which freedom stands, on which we stand as free people. And that's, you know, the basic, the stuff that Teddy Roosevelt called the square deal, that Franklin Roosevelt called the New Deal, that Lyndon Johnson called the Great Society, that, I mean, literally George Washington had Congress appropriate money to care for the poor. And in fact, James Madison's first veto was saying, we're not going to run this through a church. This is the purpose of government. So there's this long history. And now these Tea Party conservatives, parroting the words of right-wing oil billionaires, basically, are saying, no, that's not freedom. That's the antithesis of freedom. And Glenn Beck and these guys. Freedom is the freedom to, and they don't quite fill in the blank. It's almost like, though, what they're saying is that freedom is the freedom to die in the gutter.
Well, you know, you speak from a long acquaintance with the history of corporate power and progressive movements. You've written a lot of books. There isn't a talk show person that knows more than you do about it. And I might point out that this point that you've been making has been raised by Abraham Lincoln, by Thomas Jefferson, by Teddy Roosevelt, by Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They all warned about concentrated corporate power.
Yeah.
Well, Roosevelt in 1938, FDR sent a message to Congress, and he basically said, when government is controlled by private economic power, he said, quote, that's fascism. And he put a big F in front of it. That's 1938.
Right.
So,
and Henry Wallace went on in 42 in the New York Times, a whole editorial about fascism in the United States.
What market fundamentalism does is it strips the American people of the principal countervailing power to multinational corporations, which is government.
Right.
And to look at government and then say we want to obey the Constitution and we like Lincoln's government of, by, for the people, the logic of that is that people should control the government so that it can bring to them what they cannot bring to themselves. And that's the purpose of government since Jefferson and Lincoln. And what needs to be conveyed in this country, which is accepted in Western Europe, is that there are two ways people get paid: salary for work or wages for work, and community return based on what they put in through their taxes to build an economy.
Right.
And here's the rub, Tom. Name one modern burgeoning industry that wasn't launched by the taxpayer through research and development out of Washington. The biotech industry, half of the pharmaceutical industry, the containerization industry, the semiconductor computer industry, on and on. All this,
the internet.
The internet. All this came as a result of government research and development paid by the U.S. taxpayers through the Department of Defense, NASA, the National Institutes of Public Health, and given away free to these corporations, who then make it appear in their ads that they did all this.
Well, this has even been done by the drug companies now.
Yeah.
You know, most of their R&D money is actually coming through universities through grants from the federal government.
Some years ago, I wrote a letter to the top 100 U.S. CEOs, and I said, why don't you get together and have a taxpayer appreciation day? Try April 15th. Just once. Say, thank you, American taxpayers, for bailing us out, subsidizing us, giving us the R&D that creates these new industries, and making all the profits and all the bonuses for the CEOs. Only one wrote back and thought it would be a fairly good idea, but most of them were not amused.
Yeah, right. Well, you know, in 1886, in his address, in his State of the Union address, Grover Cleveland, and this is following the Citizens United decision, he said there is now the iron heel of capital is upon the neck of the people. And, you know, his famous quote from Grover Cleveland, I mean, that was, 130 years ago. We have this history, a long history in this country, literally going back to George Washington, but particularly to Jefferson's presidency, the third president, right up until, well, even Nixon in some ways pushed back on corporations. You know, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, you participated in making a lot of that happen. But where has President Obama been? I mean, you know, it's a given that George Bush wasn't going to push back on him, and it's a given but where has President Obama been on that? It seems like he's just recently caught this, you know, as a result of Citizens United. He's out there talking about, you know, the Republican crazy train, basically, and the corporate power and influence. He called out Sam Alito. He called up the Supreme Court, and Sam Alito said, you lie. And now it turns out it's obvious Sam Alito was lying. But, you know, what does that say about our politics today? I mean, you're looking at this with the long history, the perspective of the long history that you have, and how you've been pushing politics, you know, in progressive directions.
What it says is the giant corporations, through a number of levers, have crushed their opposition in the last 40 years. You're right. Nixon signed into law the Air and Water Pollution Act. He set up EPA, OSHA for job safety. Can you imagine any president doing that today?
No, it'd be called a socialist.
So here are the levers that these corporations are using. Number one, they're financing both parties. And so the Democrats started about 1980 under Tony Coelho, the congressman, basically saying, you can raise big money, Democrats, from the corporations the way the Republicans. Number one lever. Number two, they crushed the labor movement through a variety of ways. The Democrats never stood up for labor reform and repealing Taft-Hartley and all that. But then when globalization came, when WTO and NAFTA, GATT, and so on, they had a real threat. They could say, if you start a union in Arkansas, we're over the border in Mexico, we're going to China. Right. So they crushed organized labor that way, which is very weak now and losing members, especially in the corporate sector. The third thing they did was they gamed the regulatory system. They developed a massive attack on regulation, said deregulation, and then they stripped, through their influence in Congress, the enforcement budgets. The corporate crime enforcement budget in the Justice Department is smaller number of lawyers than one big corporate firm out of dozens. There's nothing there. They can't keep up with it. And even though they know from their studies that $1 in corporate crime enforcement brings back $17 to the Treasury, like fighting Medicare fraud, on fraud. And then the final thing is they've gotten into universities. Very few professors are willing enough to stand up to the corporate octopus on the universities. The funding,
a lot of them are taking money on the side.
Exactly.
I know these guys.
The moonlighting.
They get honorariums. They attend
huge
$15,000 to give a speech.
joint ventures, and so forth. So if you look at the major countervailing forces to corporate parties throughout American history, corporate power, they have neutralized, gamed, destroyed, weakened almost all of them. The biggest victory was they blurred the two-party system and turned the Democrat and Republicans on corporate issues into one corporate party with two heads wearing different makeup.
Well, and to a large extent, wasn't that the consequence of their success in destroying the labor movement? I mean, when Clinton started his presidency, or when he started running for president, he and Tony Coelho and you know, all these, Rahm Emanuel, I mean, they put together the DLC because the unions had been destroyed. There wasn't money out there outside of the corporations.
Exactly.
You know, the hope of the Obama campaign was that it could be funded by the grassroots, that we can start something from the bottom up.
He did. He got it funded.
He did.
But he also set the all-time record of money from Wall Street and corporate law firms.
Yeah, well,
so he did a double header.
I don't think he's going to get that next time around. They're not real happy with him. But the question, I just read Chris Hedges' book last weekend, and it's just dreadfully dismal. I mean, he's essentially saying, it's over. Game's over. They won. You know, screw it. Let's go home.
That's the one that's
Let's go watch football.
Death of liberalism.
Yeah. And in fact, he blames liberals, you know, for not doing enough. And I shouldn't say that. I don't want to put words in Chris Hedges' mouth.
Well, he blames universities, the churches, the unions, the liberal elite.
So, are you ready to give up?
Yeah.
I'm not.
No.
I mean, I think that there's still a battle to be fought. I think it may be 4/5 gone, but we still have a little bit to hang on to that we can pull back.
It's simple. If I was speaking to a party of Tea Partiers, a whole auditorium, and Gingrich was speaking to them, I wouldn't bet on Gingrich.
Oh, yeah.
See? Because the Tea Party, they don't like Bush and Cheney either. Remember?
Yep.
They don't like what they did, the criminal wars of aggression that weren't declared unconstitutional. They didn't like the Patriot Act. They hate the Patriot Act. They don't like the corporate bailouts at Wall Street that Bush and Cheney started. So the idea is, what's shaping it are these massive talk show hosts, Glenn Beck, Limbaugh, every day.
Who are multimillionaires themselves.
Yeah, Limbaugh makes almost $1 million every 10 days.
Yeah.
And there isn't anybody on the other side, hardly. And certainly not with that reach. Because on commercial radio and TV, corporations advertise, government doesn't. So naturally, the talk show hosts that don't criticize corporations are going to get the advertisement, and they're going to get the audience.
And as far as corporate taxes go, you know, those corporate tax rates the Republicans say are way too high, preventing business from staying in America. Consider this. Even though GE made $14 billion in profits last year, they paid zero taxes, no taxes at all. And in fact, got a tax rebate of over $3 billion, paid for by you and me. Let's look at the corporate tax picture since George W. Bush came into office and put Reaganomics on steroids. In 2000, corporations made more than $1.6 trillion in profits and paid on average 15% in taxes. That's well below the 35% rate that Republicans often tout as being too high. Nobody actually pays that rate in the United States. In fact, tax collections in the United States of the 34 OECD countries were second to the bottom. And in 2008, these corporations made even more money and paid, you guessed it, less than taxes. They made more than $1.8 trillion and paid around 12.5%. That's what an army of lobbyists paid to buy off lawmakers and blow holes in the corporate tax code can do for you. And as Pulitzer Prize-winning writer and economist David K. Johnston points out, it's the secret that Republicans don't want you to know. Yesterday, 100 members of the UAW descended on a Bank of America in Detroit, jammed up the lobby, and shut down the bank. Why? Because Bank of America didn't pay its taxes. In 2009, Bank of America made $4.4 billion in profit, money left over after the end of the year, and paid zero taxes. That's right, nada, none, zilch. Maybe that's why the bank could afford handing over a $9 million bonus to their CEO, Brian Moynihan, back in January. Union President Bob King justified the UAW's protest by saying, quote, anything that would help the middle class, Bank of America opposed. When workers are struggling to pay child care and feed their families, Bank of America in 2010 made $17.5 billion from credit card and ATM fees. Similarly, the New York Times reported today that America's largest corporation, GE, made $14 billion internationally and over $5 billion in the United States, again, in profits, and the money left over after they paid everybody else and everything else. But instead of owing taxes, they got a $3 billion tax benefit. That's as in from you and me. So how is it that an extremely profitable corporation like Bank of America pays nothing in taxes, and GE even gets money back, whereas you and I are paying up to 35% in tax rates? Why is it the corporations paid 30% of the cost to government in the 1950s, but today pay only 6.6%, with you and me picking up the rest? Well, it's not a rhetorical question. It's a real question, and there's a real answer. It's because of something called corporate personhood. For 6,000 years of human history, with few exceptions, people didn't have rights. In charge of government during those times was either a king who held a hereditary title to power, a theocrat who claimed a divine claim to power, or a warlord who'd seize power by brute force. And only the kings, theocrats, and warlords had rights. Few privileges were trickled down to the people, like the privilege to have food or to get married, but even these usually required the permission of the king. This is how feudal societies were organized and run for 6,000 years. But when our founding fathers here in the United States set out to create this country, they borrowed an idea more than 2,000 years old from the Greeks, known as democracy. They also took a good dose of it from the Iroquois Confederacy, the Native American tribes up in northern New England. And a democracy takes that system of feudal government and flips it upside down. Instead, at the top, the people hold all the rights. And the people organized a government to represent them that granted privileges to churches and corporations. That's why the first three words of the Constitution are, we the people. Our founders knew that the best defense against tyranny, the best defense against the rise of kings, theocrats, and warlords taking over America was to keep the power in the hands of the people. But over the last century and a half in America, corporations have steadily staked out more and more of what should be rights exclusively belonging to us, to living human beings, going to corporations. For example, the First Amendment right of free speech. It turns into the freedom to influence elections. Corporations are claiming that. In fact, once the Supreme Court gave them that right, transnational corporations began to carve up our tax code, create loopholes, and legalize offshore tax havens, something that wasn't happening back in the 50s. Corporations now are the new kings, and their agenda is to radically remake America into a neo-feudal system, which is why you're seeing things like the spectacles in Wisconsin, Ohio, Maine, and other states where corporate-owned politicians have come to power. Luckily, people are starting to take notice, like the UAW in Detroit and the U.S. Uncut movement taking on Bank of America, and people showing up to occupy state houses from Madison to Lansing. When we once and for all stand up and say that corporations are not people and thus do not have rights, then we will again be the America that our founders envisioned, a government that Lincoln said is government of the people, by the people, and for the people.